So I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the future. Perhaps this is because I run an organization called the 2050 Climate Group. The future is right there in the title. But this is also because I am an optimist. Pragmatic optimist, but an optimist nonetheless. I believe in a better option. I believe in a better future. I believe in, but also find comfort in, the idea of constant change. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about change. Big, scary, constant change. So just under 3 years ago, the 2050 Group, the organization that I chair, was founded. And this organization works to educate, empower, and engage the next generation of leaders to lead the low-carbon transition. And we do this specifically through a program called our Young Leaders Development Program. So we talk a lot about the program and a lot about our future leaders, but what we do, distilled way down, we don't often talk about in quite these terms, but fundamentally we work on change. We work on changing the high carbon, high emissions, unsustainable present into a future that we as young people want to be a part of and feel that we can thrive in. Now we call this transformational change. Perhaps many of you have heard this word. It's a bit of a buzzword, I have to admit. In my field, I use it probably every day and have totally lost touch with what it means. But I want to break down today what that means to me and what that means to what I do and what we do. And the most important thing to start with, and the foundation of this, is that my idea of change is founded on the idea that today's young people are the most important stakeholder when it comes to working on, planning, creating, designing, shaping the future. It is, after all, their future. It is their lives. It is our lives. This most certainly applies to the low-carbon transition, but it also applies to pretty much every sector of society that's facing some kind of change and needing to plan for the future. And so the 2050 Group works on creating a system in Scotland where young people are at the core of decision-making, at the core of planning for the future, where today's young people, or tomorrow's future leaders, as we call them, are designing the future that they want to see, a healthy, sustainable, prosperous, secure, stable, happy future that they want. This is a transformation in the way that we manage and govern our societies, but it's also a change in the way that we manage change itself. Second to this, the 2050 Group works to create a new normal, a world where climate action is mainstreamed. Because climate change at the end of the day affects everything, from a chocolate bar you might love, to the roads you might drive on, to how you might heat your home, to the recent courgette or lettuce or frankly whatever is next, scarcity. It's in everything and it's everywhere, and it's time that we start considering it in decision-making in everything and everywhere. And we as an organization are training young people to be able to do this. In this way, we are working on a bigger cultural transformation. Over time, we've seen shifts in values and cultural transformations based on changes in our lives, our surroundings, our society. Perhaps the most recent and relevant example of this is the communication revolution that resulted from the mass sale of the smartphone. Think about the change and the impact that has had on your daily lives. That is the scale of change and cultural transformation that we are talking about and we are working on. We hope that what we do will create a change in normal the same way that the smartphone did. We'll hit a reset button on what is the cultural normal so that low carbon is commonplace, just like having a smartphone. Both of these visions that I've just described are visions of the future, and the scale of change to the status quo that these ideas propose is transformational change. This is how I define transformational change. And personally, I find this both thrilling and utterly terrifying at the same time, and in equal measure. But I want to go one step more to just talking about what transformational change is and talk about why. Why do I work on this scale of change? Why do I think about this scale of change? And the answer is actually somewhat in the idea of change itself. There is one fundamental link between these two visions of the future that I just described, and it's not the low-carbon vision. It's actually the idea that they both accept that there is no such thing as business as usual in our world anymore. Full stop. There are no caveats to this. These two visions fundamentally embrace the idea of constant change, and they choose to work with it, not against it. So to put this into perspective, to talk about this in relation to what I do, working on climate change, this means that we either successfully transform our society, our energy systems, our way of living into one that's low carbon, and we significantly reduce emissions quickly, or we wait too long. We allow ourselves to become paralyzed by fear and indecision and inability and lack of knowing how to move forward on this, and we end up having to take massive measures in a reactionary way to be able to adapt to our changing climate and, most importantly, our changing home. There are certainly scenarios in between these two extremes, but the future is somewhere on this spectrum, this scale of change, this scale of transformation. This is a very difficult reality to grasp, to wrap your head around. However, the only way to not become paralyzed by the fear of uncertainty about the future and potentially disastrous scenarios that we might face is to wholeheartedly embrace the change that this means to our lives. Maybe many of you already get this, but I have a story to tell that's a bit of a personal one to hopefully elaborate on this. So I recently went back to studying. I went back to do a master's after spending 4 years working for an environmental NGO here in Glasgow. The other day I was in the library and I was daydreaming, as you do, and was all of a sudden very aware of the students around me, what they were studying and what they were doing. And perhaps you could even call it eavesdropping on the books they were looking at and the lecture slides they were flipping through as they prepared for exams. And I noticed across from me were 2 business management students, behind me, petroleum engineering student, and to my right, a social worker student. And looking at what they were studying and understanding their habits and the slides they were flipping through, I realized that none of them are actually being taught to prepare for the future of their field. These business students were reading an organizational management book from the 1990s. It's 2017. Our model, our way of working as a society needs to move beyond that, and arguably in so many ways it already has. But for some reason, these students are still learning that this is the world that they need to learn and understand because it's the world that they will live and work in, but that's not true. They're religiously memorizing the dogma and rhetoric of these textbooks that had no idea what 2017 would look like, let alone the world that they'll be working in 2020, 2030, 2050. And the same goes for that petroleum engineering student. Were any of her lecturers telling her about when in 10, 20, 30 years' time, her industry will change so significantly that she will need to reskill? Or have they asked her how she plans to prepare for the personal ethical questions that she might face? Will she be willing to work in the Arctic? Will she be willing to work on national parks or conservation lands? Are her teachers and lecturers preparing her for how to make these decisions in her career? These 2 examples are how we reinforce the status quo of the world that we live in. This is how change doesn't happen. Or perhaps this is actually how we create a society that isn't able to embrace change as we move forward into the future. You teach the next generation to use and perpetuate this business as usual mantra and system, and you never make any progress. Those of us like myself who work on this wicked climate change issue, we spend a lot of time modeling and planning and conceptualizing and thinking about the future without realizing that we are utterly failing to prepare people for it. We envision the future, but we teach the past. Us students, yes, we are all learning in this teaching, but often I wonder for what? For what future? For what world? Or more importantly, for whose vision of the future and for whose world? Very few of us are really daring to see beyond the world that we are taught. In what I do and in what the 2050 Climate Group does, we are daring to see a different future, a different vision of the future, and pursue that. Fundamentally, I think I'm able to do this because I see that this change is actually a great thing. It means the canvas is blank. The future is something to be created and molded and shaped and touched and designed. I accept that business as usual just doesn't exist. That's not the world in which I live. Or perhaps another way to think about it is that business as usual is actually constant change. That is our business as usual. But when you talk about this, what's not often seen when we talk about change is the harsh reality that we are only moving in one direction. No matter how much many of us might feel that what's happening recently in the UK or the US or the world is moving backwards, that there's some kind of destruction to progress, that there's a cyclical process happening. This isn't true. Time is linear. And so to wholeheartedly embrace change actually means to move forward from the present, not a present you wish was the case, not a denial of the present situation, not a nostalgia for a better time. We can't go back there. We often talk about fighting back. This is the rhetoric of campaigners. I'm fighting back against something. But we should not fight back against the things we don't want to see. We should talk about fighting forward, because that's all we can do. Work with the dynamism of change instead of against it. When I began my role as chair of the 2050 Climate Group, I was 24. I had a few years out of university. I had no idea what the organization was going to become in our founding days. I had no idea what the role was going to be or morph into. I certainly had no leadership experience. I had never spoken publicly. I did not consider myself as a person with any kind of authority or legitimacy. I just knew that something needed to be done and someone needed to do it, and I was willing. The thing is, at this particular point in time, when we were first getting started, there was a leadership void for the organization. But instead of seeing this as a void, I saw this as an opportunity. It was not intimidating or scary, it was exciting. I saw an opportunity to influence the direction of travel, to embrace the process and possibility that comes with driving change, and use that to create the vision of the future that I imagined. So here's the truth about what I do. Every day, I use the idea of transformational change and constant change that is taking place to work on putting into place the vision of the future that I want. I fight forward every single day. In cold, hard business terms, I exploit change. I'm capitalizing on change, on the reality of change as a constant to achieve my goals. Now, that language is deliberately manipulative and provocative because we're not used to talking about change in that way. We don't talk about the concept of change as something that can be used to achieve something. But that's what I do. And the key word here, I think, in all of this is opportunity. In that time and now, these days, many of us see a void. A void of leadership, perhaps. A void of hope. A void of vision. A void of positivity. A void of possibility. But there is no void. There is never and was never a void. There is only opportunity. Voids create opportunity. Change creates opportunity. It's just how we choose to see this. But if you embrace this and take this on, we must now recognize that this mentality means that change is never done. The work is never done. Change is constant. Time never stops. So to embrace change means to not be passive about your defeats, but more importantly than that, it means to not be passive about your victories and what you might achieve, because this too can change. It means in the pursuit of our dreams and our visions of the future, we must infinitely take one step more. Thank you.